khutbah, we entitled it Building Intentional Community. We wanted to reflect on the Quran in a general and in a specific way on Surah Al-A'raf. In this surah, which is translated as the heights, and it speaks about the difference between the believers and the unbelievers on the Day of Judgment. It was revealed in the last phase of the Muslims existing in Mecca prior to the Hijrah. And in this phase, there were about 4 phases, 4 classifications. You can classify the Meccan period in different ways. But in general, you go from no hostility to outright violence and warring against the Muslims. And this is what forced ultimately the Muslims completely out, for the most part, of Mecca. And it was a process which we began to see it began to be noticeable during the time period in which the Muslims, some of them went to Habasha, they went to Africa. There began to be hostility towards the whole of the Muslim community. Quraysh had its tactics and its approaches, and of those approaches, it was this idea of defaming the Prophet ﷺ, whose name is Muhammad bin Abdullah, Muhammad the son of Abdullah ﷺ. He was known to them. They watched him grow up, ﷺ. They knew his people, his lineage, his family, his tribe. He was not a person that was not unknown. And the reason why I mentioned that is because the tactic of Quraysh was to take someone that was known to the people. He was known by the laqab or the name Al-Amin to the people before the revelation of the Quran. He was mixed in the community, deeply in the community, even had the position of negotiating situations to keep the peace amongst the tribes. And the custom at that time was that when there was conflict, it would go on for generations. So the role of the Prophet ﷺ prior to the revelation of Quran was something that was very clear to Quraysh. But and yet the tactic of Quraysh was to make reality distorted, to distort who the Prophet ﷺ was. They used a lot of different tactics, people. They used a lot of different tactics, whether it was offering dunya or position or trying to influence by the back door. Look, Quraysh was even at the level where when some of the Muslim community left Mecca to go to Africa, which is a distance, different culture, different people, different language, different religion, they themselves went all the way over there to bring them back, people. You see the level that they had with regard to oppression? They felt that they can go all the way to another land, and when those people made hijrah, when they left that land to seek the conditions that will allow Iman to exist, they felt as though that they owned those people so much that they would go into another country and pull them out. That's the level that Quraysh was at. Now it's a very interesting, there's some debate or some inquiry, we should say, some investigation into Sirah, the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the companions. The popular opinion of that historical situation when the Muslims went to Africa is that they were super weak. They went and they were going because they couldn't stand the persecution. That's the dominant narrative. But there's another insight into it which makes it very interesting. And it has some support and justification. And that's that the Muslims, when they saw that the conditions in Mecca were becoming problematic, they didn't stay put. They were proactive. And so they picked Africa, in this case Habasha, because of the conditions that were there. And there were some details, there's some details that are not spoken about. That's important. Quraysh didn't have any authority over the ruler of Habasha. Quraysh didn't have any ghalaba, any power over the economy in Habasha. And Quraysh, ما دخل لهم في دينهم. They didn't have any entry point in their deen. So in this sense, Habasha represented a free, just society, which these people with the long hand of corruption and oppression, founded in their disbelief and in their arrogance, because they had a prophet that was sent to them, and they rejected it. A people with no book, no standing in the world. Today we would say they were, refined battle rappers. Their language skills, yes, they were high level. That's not to belittle people or dehumanize them. There were good qualities in Jahiliyyah as well as bad qualities. But the point is that with regard to their treatment of the Prophet, they don't get any standing for that. They don't get any praise for that. Because it was the love of Allah that was there, embodied in the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and they rejected him. And their arrogance reached that point that they felt as though when the believers went into that spot where they had conditions to live, that they can prevent that. Now, strategically, some say that the believers went there because it was a place of economic standing, it was a place of security, it was a place of justice, it was a place of freedom, and they were thinking about the future of the Muslim community. They were thinking about the existence of the Muslim community in the future, so they picked an environment. It's like they did a feasibility study, and they said, for the continuance of our community, we're going to go into these conditions, and we're going to be there and root ourselves. And in the meantime, the community of the Muslims in Mecca, they were preparing the way in Medina, because the going to Medina was not just haphazard. It was not just like, okay, tonight, we see that there's problems in the street, so we're going to pack up and we're going to move next day. That didn't work like that. There were people that were already going to the Medinan community and preparing them. And by the way, the Medinan community, it was also related to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ by way of his mother. So the Prophet ﷺ had a relationship with Medina. But the da'wah was such that people were strategically chosen to go into Medina and prepare the people for that reality. The reality of deen and the reality of support. And clear agreements were taken from the Ansar that they would support the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ before the Prophet shifted and made hijrah. There was a time period where a lot of us, we took the idea of hijrah and the love of the deen. We're not going to judge people's intention, but the action was incorrect. Like the deen says to make hijrah, so we're going to make hijrah, and we end up in multiple lands, in multiple places, without any support system, without anything, and then it fails. May Allah reward the intention of those that made that type of hijrah, but that's not the type of community building, that's the sunnah. The Prophet ﷺ, when we talk about the sunnah in this sense, the Prophet ﷺ took the asbab, took the means, and depended upon Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. That's the true understanding of tawakkul and tawheed. So there was planification, there was stratification. Stratification in this case, strategizing and pointing people to responsibilities, roles and tasks. And so by the time you get to the last stage of Mecca, you have that crisis that was taking place that forced some of the Muslims out to Habasha. You have the Prophet ﷺ going to Ta'if, and you know the story of Ta'if, the way the people of Ta'if, they treated the Prophet ﷺ, they stoned him. And that's the sunnah of the Anbiya. That's the way of the Anbiya, alayhimussalam, that they want good for humanity, but humanity itself doesn't want good for itself. Humanity itself wars against those who are sent by Allah Ta'ala in their best interests. That's why we talk about building intentional community. There's no such thing just as the building of the community of Medina without a clear struggle taking place amongst the believers themselves. One of the lessons that we get from the Hijrah to Habasha is that the Muslims were ready to change people. Because they went to Habasha, it was a different language, it was different food, different geography, different customs. And some take from that and their analysis of Sirah that it shows that the deen is salihun li kulli makan wa zaman. That the deen can be implemented in any place and in any time. That it transcends culture and ethnicity and tribe. That doesn't mean that culture and ethnicity and tribe doesn't have its value and its place in the deen. After all, it's Allah Ta'ala that created our colors and our tongues. But it's not the basis upon which society is built. See that? When you make that the basis upon which society is built, then you create problems in society. It's not a society built on taqwa. But by the time this surah is revealed, Quraysh is so arrogant that they have engaged in murder and in boycott. And I've even had some debates with some in the study of Sirah. And I said that this had all of the descriptions in place or characteristics in place for the term genocide. Quraysh was engaged in the genocide. They were trying to wipe out the Muslims. Or if you don't want to say genocide, we say ethnic cleansing. They were trying to wipe out that community, and even when they went out of the geographical sphere, they still persisted in engaging in oppression. They tried to use the influence or tried to undermine the concept of international law. They tried to use every means, boycott, cutting the food supply, cutting the water supply, locking down the economy, engaging in torture, engaging in violence, all the ingredients there. So what was the position of the Muslims? Surah Al-A'raf gives us that framework in that time period. And we see some guidance. One of the things that we see, one of the things that is important to understand, and actually this principle is brought out by one of the scholars of Hadith, Mahir Fahid, from the ulama of Iraq, Hafidhullah. What's the position of Muslims يعني في وقت الشدائد والأزمة والمصيبة? What's the position of the Muslims, simply put, in the time of hardship and while we're undergoing oppression? لا نفرق الله أبدا. We don't disconnect ourselves from Allah under any conditions. That's a jihad in itself. Why? Because the ultimate reality that we even see the Anbiya there is Mata Nasrullah. When will the aid of Allah come? The heart of the human being can only take so much. When you look at the realities of the dunya and the realities of the world, that's looking. But what about when you're suffering it? What about when you're under the trial and the tribulation of it? It's different than being the onlooker or the bystander or the third party or the voyeur. When you're in the struggle, it's a different reality than when you're onlooking. And we are impacted just by onlooking. But then what about what you see. And, within the last 2 decades, there's enough lessons for the Muslim community. There used to be a video before the fake videos and all of that type of stuff. There was a video of a brother that was being buried in Syria alive. He was being buried alive by soldiers who were, in this case, kafir, trying to make him engage in kufr. And so they're telling him, say that Assad is Allah. At that time, the leader. So the whole time in the video, he's going in the ground being buried. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Buried. Maintaining iman in that type of situation, when the possibility of saving your life is there, or so to speak, and deciding to face and confront death and face Allah wa ta'ala in that situation, it demands a certain type of heart and a certain type of condition. You have to be ready to go. You have to be ready to detach yourself from the dunya. You have to be eager to meet Allah, to see the face of Allah. We have this Dars and Aqidah, Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, they believe that they will see the face of Allah in the hereafter. That's textbook Aqidah. But here, this is real Aqidah in the sense that that's going from the reality of just a line that you're reciting in a textbook to being ready to see Allah wa ta'ala in the hereafter. Not delaying it, but making the move and staying firm on La ilaha illallah. In some of the situations that we see with some of our brothers and sisters in Gaza, the only thing you're hearing is bombs are being dropped. La ilaha illallah. Allahu Akbar. La ilaha illallah. Allahu Akbar. In the face of death. And the Muslims in the first generation, radiallahu anhum ajma'in, in the face of losing everything, in the face of losing their wealth and their standing, for the sake of La ilaha illallah, they made their hijrah. And they followed the Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam, who was a nasih to them, who was one that wanted good for them. They didn't fight him. And they left everything for Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala to build that community. In order for us to build community, we're going to have to revise ourselves. Hard position. Because the first thing that we do is we want to establish ourselves. But here we have to decrease in that regard. If we want to establish iman, not only in our hearts individually, that's liberalism. In your heart by yourself, it doesn't have any relationship to society, doesn't have relationship to life. The deen is only in the masjid. We hide it in the workplace. We hide it in society. We don't have any responsibility. That's not Islam. It's a beginning point of iman, but it's not the reality of iman. But if we want to see the deen in our community and in our families, the lessons that we see for the last 20 years or so, a couple decades of the destruction of the Muslim world should be enough of a series of reflections for us to understand what time is upon us. There's so much في كلام كثير هولا هل نحن في آخر الزمان and all this type of stuff. Are we at the end of time? People bring out this hadith, that hadith, sometimes weak hadith, problematic hadith. And we mentioned this before, like we should be looking not at whether we're at the end of time, we should be looking at what is our responsibility, and we should be really thinking like Imam Ibn Khaldun in the sense that actually what we're before, and I'm going to prove it to you in the little bit of time that we left, is we're before civilizational decline. And there's a lot of signs in that regard. When humanity is led by people throughout the world that have agreed to the idea of humanitarian law, which was the consequence or the result of them killing each other globally in World War II, then they came up with this idea of international humanitarian law to govern the values of war when they say we're not going to go by this. This doesn't apply to judge actions as right or wrong. Then we have a crisis in humanity. Because that means there's no standard for understanding an action to be right or wrong. The conditions for justice become problematic. We even know that in the time of Jahiliyyah, prior to the revelation of the Quran and Hilf al-Fudul, in the Pact of Fudul, the Fadl brothers, Fadl, that's where the word Fudul comes from. They came together to agree with one another that they would not oppress the people and they were people of kufr. But they had a sense of justice. And the Prophet ﷺ, he affirmed that if that type of pact were to exist today, in that time period of revelation, the time period when Islam is clear, that he would affirm it. So whatever is there as far as goodness and justice amongst other nations and communities, we affirm it. Because Islam affirms what's just. We're not going to remove ourselves from affirming the idea of justice, even if another people is calling what justice is. We have to affirm it. Because we have to be the people that build. Just like when it comes to the issue of enjoining the good and forbidding the evil, how can we implement that? Some may come to an argument and say, well, we can't implement it. There's no ruler, there's no khilaf. In the democratic process, with all of its deficiencies, we have the ability to enjoin what is good and forbid what is evil openly in the society. We're not for the destruction of life. Tell me what's anti-Islam about that. So when we talk about building intentional community, we have to know where we stand in the world today. And we have to know our conditions, and we have to understand the situation of the Ummah and what's the obligation of the time and what are our priorities. Because when we look over the last 2 decades, we see the intentional destruction of the Ummah and the making of the Ummah into a refugee population, but we don't see a response coming from the Muslim community that's equivalent to the situation. We see a tanaffus fil madiyat, the competition and material gain. Al-hakam mutakathur is not a lesson for us. We don't see the priority of having to invest in ourselves and in our families and in our communities and in our children, in individuals, in our development, so that we rebuild the Ummah. That's what the Prophet did, alayhi salatu wasalam. When the conditions were genocide, he had prepared the way to build the Ummah in Medina. And he was patient with the situation in Mecca, because there would be a time when Mecca will be open and they will have to rebuild Mecca. There's going to be a time when Gaza will be open and we will have to rebuild Gaza. There's going to be a time where we will be able to take the refugees from different places and address them. There's going to be a time where the Muslims return back to the da'wah that we understood. When we were looking at people like Al-Hajj, Malik Shabazz and others, that we were going into distressed communities and we were taking individuals and we were rebuilding them up. If we don't have that as a concept, then we don't have an idea of what is our responsibility. You don't necessarily have to be engaged in it yourself, but you have to support the rebuilding. So when we look, we see in Surah Al-Araf, as a basic framework, the first thing that's being talked to us about is the story of Adam and the war between Adam and Shaitan. It's a perpetual giving in the dunya. That the children of Adam, just like Adam alayhi salatu wasalam, will be engaged in a perpetual struggle with Shaitan and how Shaitan manifests. And so part of the game plan of us in this temporary period of existence that we call dunya is to maintain ourselves firm. And then the Quran goes in Surah Al-Araf after that to talk about another theme, which is separating the guidance of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala from the way of Shaitan. And in other words, there's some clarity here. This is not moral relativism. This is not confusion. We have the ability to understand some sense of right or wrong and what direction and what's beneficial, what's not beneficial. We have that, there's some things that are thabit, and there's some things which are mutaghayyira. Some things which don't change and some things which change. But there's some foundational things of humanity, if we want to understand how humanity is guided, that they don't change. And we as Muslims, alhamdulillah, we have an authentic transmission of revelation which can be accessible to the average person that has the basic level of Arabic at a fundamental level. The Quran gives us that sense of hidayah. And then it goes into talking about the message that's sent down by Allah and the idea of who Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is, and the idea of the prophets and the idea of resurrection. The idea of resurrection is important because that's where you have a sense of accountability and justice. So if it escapes in this world because people don't want to enjoy the good and forbid the evil, it's not going to escape Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. But when we say, كُنْتُمْ خَيْرَ أُمَّةٍ أُخْرِجَتْ لِلنَّاسِ, let's not be like Bani Israel. Kuntum khayru ummat. You're the best of people. We're the best of people. Let's not be like, fall into the trap of Bani Israel, that they thought, and they still think, some of them, that they have the hands of Allah tied, that they can do whatever they want to do on the earth and there's no consequences, that they're alleviated from moral responsibility. That the idea of, because what they suffered on the earth, it gives them the key to do whatever they want. That's not the reality. The Muslims can't think that way. That we're the best of people and that's it. There's conditions that come along with that. تُؤْمِرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَتَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ. This is the concept of a jama'ah. You have an understanding of what is good, and this comes before saying it's haram, prohibiting people. How can we hold people to any conditions of right or wrong if we haven't shared the reality of the teachings of Islam at the basic fundamental level? How can we tell the children this haram, haram? They don't understand what good is. How can they distinguish the reality of what's haram? Remember that haram, or remember that Jahannam is surrounded by things that are beautiful and things that are attractive and desirous, and Jannah is surrounded by hardship and struggle. So the natural tendency of all of us is to look at what is haram, unless we have the guidance to clarify for us that confusion that comes into the mix because of the war with shaitan. And then afterwards, this is the part that we want to focus on in the short period of time that's left. In Surah Al-A'raf, there's a whole section between ayat 59 and 171. We give this as homework for people to go back and reflect. There's a series of stories of the prophets that are brought. There we can begin to understand the rise and the fall of civilization, people. Or the rise and the fall of the Muslim community. Here we have to work on the rise of the Muslim community, the building of the Muslim community. And so then we go from there. So the ayah that we wanted to focus on is an ayah which is very interesting. We find that Saleh says certain things to his people, but the Quran describes Saleh as having turned away. فَتَوَلَّ عَنْهُمْ وَقَالَ يَا قَوْمِ لَقَدْ أَبْلَغْتُكُمْ رِسَالَةَ رَبِّي وَنَصَحْتُ لَكُمْ وَلَكِنْ لَا تُحِبُّونَ النَّاصِحِينَ. And we have to close out. Saleh, we close with this, turns away from his people after destruction hits, after he warned them of right or wrong, and then he turns to his people and he tells them, I did my responsibility. I educated you. And then he says, not only did I educate you, he shows his relationship with Allah, Risalata Rabbi. I educated you in what it is that Allah, my Rabb, has informed me. And then he says, he tells them openly, I gave you good counsel, but you don't love the people of good counsel. Fight against them. And so when we talk about the issue of nasiha, and I'm push you for a few more minutes of time, forgive me for my bad adab. The issue of nasiha, we find it in the hadith very clearly, the hadith of Tamim al-Dari, ad-dinu nasiha. And the Sahaba, how they understand this, what is good counsel, what is nasiha? Immediately they ask, how do we implement it? Said, for who is it? And they said, it's for Allah. Our relationship with Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala has to be intact. For the book of Allah, it has to be the center. For the messenger, the motto of the messenger alayhi salatu wasalam has to be there for us. And then the last part, it says, وَلِيَمَّةُ الْمُسْلِمِينَ وَعَمَّتِهِمْ. It has to be organizational leadership, people. We're failing in that. Leaders that love us. Leaders that we love. Sincerity and purity of heart in our actions with regard to establishing what is good. The response in the age of crisis is that focusing on rebuilding our relationship with Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala, with the book of Allah, with the messenger, rebuilding our community by organizing it properly. I'm not saying don't do other things, but that's foundational in the idea of intentional community.